Welcome to Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, our panel discuss how society has changed and ask whether our obsession with the individualism has eroded community values. Has life in the 21st century become all about the cult of the individual? Recorded live at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, our expert panellists include Cathy Ray, Max Dickens, and Professor Christina Victor.
So it's by a stroke of tremendous fortune and luck that we're all here in this room together. It was meant to be. Yeah. We're here despite fate's many interventions. Something marvellous is going to happen. So just believe it.
Yeah.
Just, what's the word?
Don't ask
Let's
for your money
manifest
back
it.
Every single audience member is going to have a framed photo of themselves put up on the wall like this. By the end. And your own coat of armour.
Individualism is the opposite of what's happening right now. Individualism, the habit or principle of being independent or self-reliant, or the social theory of valuing freedom of action or freedom of identity over collective values or state control. Has it gone too far? Has it gone too far? Have we lost our sense of community? Do we act without regard to society? Are we all suffering as a consequence of some people suffering more than others? Let's find out. That's why we're here, to venture as a tiny group into the caves of knowledge and insight and experience.
Torches on.
And helmets.
I think she's trying to fill time.
They're coming up the stairs. Hey, we've got you now. You're ours. You're ours.
That would be a great satire of individualism if we all formed a cult, though. That would be like a great.
So do you know what? One of the things I didn't check out, Cathy, so now I'm glad there isn't a huge room in front of me. Is it Cathy Ray? Is that how we pronounce it?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's got like a random E in there.
Yeah.
And I had a little
You can thank
panic.
the Irish.
It's what?
You can thank the Irish.
Oh, okay. Cathy Ray, who is a journalist who covers pop culture, motherhood and sex through a disability lens. And we have Max Dickens, who is lots of things, but for the purpose of today, is primarily the author of Billy No Mates. More from them later. Now me. I'm Claire Shaw. I am, amongst other things, a poet, and my last book was called Towards a General Theory of Love, and it is a poetic exploration of attachment and love, and I shan't be reading from it today, although I convinced those two I was. Just go. And here's a poem about my mother. What do you think of that? I won't be reading from that today, but it does mean I have, a huge interest in what we're here to talk about, which in the green room sounded a lot like our favourite characters in Succession. That was the thing that got us really excited. No, seriously, we are here to talk about individualism. Cathy, I think we'll start with you. So, Cathy, covering culture and representation in everything. I read through a lot of Cathy's articles, everything from medicine to come dancing, and also the reason that me and my teenager have just completely binge-watched in 2 days A Kind of Spark. It's absolutely brilliant, and I'm telling everybody to watch it. Good. Can I get you, first of all, just to tell us a little bit about your work, and then maybe you can read a bit for us.
Okay. Just to let you know, the reading was not my suggestion, and I oppose it strongly, but apparently it's a requirement of this panel. So I'm Cathy, thanks Claire, and I'm a freelance journalist, and I have chapters in 2 books coming out this month, both on the same day, controversially, July the 27th. One is called No Offence But by the activist Gina Martin, and one is called Everyday Activism, Everyday Change by Naomi and Natalie Evans. I'm primarily concerned with disability justice and disability politics, I have an invested interest in relationships and how we form these through a disability lens, and how this shift of how we rely on each other is altered when one or more of us is disabled, either temporarily or permanently. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a bit today. Where I'm going to read from is my chapter in Gina Martin's book. The chapter is basically me recounting an experience as a disabled mother where I felt extremely isolated, which I'm sure a lot of parents can identify with, but also a lot of disabled people can identify with as well. So without further ado, I only have to scroll a little way down on my Facebook feed to find examples of the type of inspiration porn that often go viral on social media. A photo of a girl who has no limbs painting a picture with a brush in her mouth, and the words "disability didn't stop her, what's your excuse?" plastered across the bottom. A picture of a child who has Down syndrome smiling and putting their thumbs up with the age-old phrase, "The only disability in life is bad attitude," around their frame. A photo of Stevie Wonder at a piano with the text, "Every blind man's hero," underneath. Sometimes, when people treat me as inspirational, it makes me think they're doing it just because they don't want to help. Like Supermum 3000. You'll find out about Supermum 3000 if you read the book. They see independence as the goal of my existence and don't want to interfere with it. Doesn't every good disabled person want to achieve things by themselves? I'm a big fan of interdependence, the kind of society where, when we need to, we draw on each other's strengths and work together. The kind of society where we don't see it as a failing on someone's part if they're unable to complete something on their own. Like non-disabled people, I have strengths completely irrelevant to my disability, though my double-jointedness is my favourite party trick. And also, like non-disabled people, there are things I might need help with from time to time too. Putting disabled people on pedestals for their achievements removes our agency to lean on others for support if we need to. We're not a failure if we need backup. Nobody is. So when a non-disabled person refers to a disabled person or something they've done as inspirational, or puts us up on a pedestal just for existing, help them to understand we deserve the same agency, privacy, humanity as everyone else. Highlight that doing so reduces us to our disabilities when we are so much more than that. Talk about why it's problematic to offer unsolicited compliments like these, particularly for everyday tasks, and explain that achievements are awesome, no matter who makes them. Like Stella Young, the disabled activist who died a little while ago, said, disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does.
I have to almost retract my body from a curled up phase of complete mortification at some of those comments that you read out. What was the one? Disability doesn't... What's your excuse? What is it?
Disability didn't stop them. Yeah, what's your excuse?
What's your excuse? What to you is embedded in that statement? Disability didn't stop them. What's your excuse?
The idea that we should... The goal is, and that success is always found in us doing things by ourselves.
Yeah. So almost like you say it as the opposite of interdependence. And I know when we were chatting by email, I was talking about a conversation. So I identify as disabled. My disabilities are hidden. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who has very visible disabilities. And she had some amputations not that long ago, and one of the first things that people said to her was, now you can enter the Paralympics. You know, a person less likely to enter the Olympics is hard to think of than my mate Jackie. And her comeback was always, well, now you can enter the Olympics, as though all that's required to be in the Paralympics is having limbs removed or being poorly.
Or as though that's the only route for success for disabled people.
Yeah, is to be a Paralympian. And then we can be on posters. Yeah, and then we had this conversation about sometimes having our courage, recognised, can feel like a pleasant stroke, but that both of us felt kind of objectified or somehow uncomfortable when we talked about our lives and had people go, oh, you're so brave. And I think you really nailed it in this chapter in a way I've never seen done before, that what people are doing is celebrating self-reliance above anything else, as well as objectifying.
And they're making themselves feel better for not.
Yeah, for not helping.
For not being involved.
Yeah. I don't know if this is a question that you could answer because it's so wide, but I wondered that if what we're saying to people, if what me and Jackie were objecting to, stop calling me bloody brave for having a Twix or for, having a cup of tea and talking to you, some furious nodding going on in the audience, then what to you is brave? What would be brave and inspiring?
I think it's much more personal for me. So, for example, I am terrified of driving, right? And I don't drive. If I learned to drive, I would be really proud of myself, and I would be really happy with other people being proud of me. Me being terrified of being able to drive has nothing to do with my disability. I'm just terrified of it. It's a control thing. I'm a control freak. But yeah, like I would be totally happy with people being happy for me because they know what a big deal it is for me personally.
Yeah.
It's, my disability obviously affects my ability to drive, but it's not the be all and end all. And so, once we realise, that whole person has done something that's completely out of their comfort zone for their benefit and that will help others as well, that kind of thing. And it isn't tied to some, capitalistic venture.
Yeah, that somehow it's things that are outside of our comfort zone that might be about other people's benefits, but not necessarily related to our disabilities. Max, I can't help but wonder how you would answer that question. How would you see courage coming from your angle, which is thinking about masculinity?
I suppose, so I talk and write a lot about men and masculinity, so if you understand masculinity to an extent is a performance, so you perform your masculinity before your gender, and there are some rules about how you're meant to go about being a man. What would feel brave to me is when you can break through those rules, that performance, and do it. So, for example, telling my male friends that I liked them and that they were really important to me, that might sound like a tiny little gesture, and it's kind of like, that's not brave though, is it, mate? I mean, come on. That for me was like the kind of the knot of discomfort in your stomach. That felt brave. So I think bravery and courage is about expressing your full self in an environment which doesn't want to notice all those aspects.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. I've not thought of that before. Thank you. I love it when you kind of push to think in a different direction. And I guess that's what a lot of your work is about, both of you. And I was wondering, coming back to you, Kathy, so we've started off through the lens of individualism and asking that question, is emphasis a rightful, as a queer person, this has always been tremendously important to me, growing up in a very homophobic and very kind of closed background, that I could celebrate my personal identity, and growing up in a very oppressive kind of family structure, that there was freedom of action for me within that. It's quite a thing for me to begin to consider that maybe there are downsides to that. And I want to come back to you again on that question. If we're thinking about individualism, if we're thinking about potentially community values and collective values falling apart, if we're thinking about an increase in loneliness or an increase in isolation, do you think that this is having a disproportionate impact on disabled people?
We saw that a lot in the pandemic, right? Nobody gave a shit about disabled people, and still now a lot of disabled people are at home because COVID is still going, and nobody gives a shit. And it was really interesting to me. I'm obviously a very privileged disabled person. I'm middle class. I have a bit of money. I have a job. You know, I'm white. I recognise all of those things. And yet in the pandemic, you know, I, like many other people, was confined to my home. And I had children, very young children to look after by myself. And I had a lot of physical tasks to do alone suddenly that I would have otherwise relied on other people to help me with. And, you know, it was deemed for quite a while that was too dangerous to let other people into our homes and things like that. And there was always this kind of like, well, you can get on with it because this is how we made you. Like Thatcher in the 1970s was like, it's all about the individual and individual success. And ever since then, you know, we've been working towards being completely independent. But how do we do that as disabled people? We don't. We fall short. And actually, how do we do it as anybody? Because everybody needs people for stuff. But yeah, I think in the pandemic that really highlighted how vulnerable disabled people are in society. And it's not because they're disabled, it's because we don't know how to be in community anymore.
We don't know how to be in community anymore. I've got to write that down. That's such a statement. What do you mean by that we don't know how to be in community anymore?
We don't know how to work together in a way that's non-hierarchical. We don't know how to, I don't know, help each other selflessly. Obviously, there are pockets of that. There are pockets of community projects and people who do wonderful things. But as a society, we're told not to do that. We're told to look after yourself.
Use the word vulnerable, and I'm really interested in that. And I'm aware that vulnerable became a really difficult word through lockdown. But I think it's been a difficult word for a long time. And you know, we'll also have particular resonance when we're thinking about constructions of masculinity and femininity. I was asked recently, because a lot of my work is with people who share similar experiences to me around neurodivergence, mental health, trauma, and I was asked to write a chapter about working with vulnerable people. And in the end, I wrote a chapter about working with vulnerability, because there's no such thing as vulnerable groups and invulnerable groups. We're all vulnerable to different degrees in different contexts. And it made me think about how the term vulnerable group in lockdown was used to kind of pathologise disabled people, that the vulnerability somehow lies within you or within me, rather than being about the context that we're living in. Vulnerability. How do you experience that from a masculinity perspective?
I think you're vulnerable when you express things which you're likely or perceived to be likely to be judged for and are maybe stigmatized. So I wrote a book called Billy No Mates. It's essentially about men and friendship and men's friendship problem. And the stats show, since they started measuring this in the early 70s, men would have less friends, and especially less close friends than women. And as we get older, our social world shrinks to a much greater extent than it does in the female social world on average. But to connect to vulnerability, admitting that, writing a book called Billy No Mates, I mean, it's a double-edged sword being a face of that, because it's not something you're really meant to talk about. So admitting that you maybe don't have the social connections you want, that's a vulnerable thing. Trying to, in the middle of relationships that you've had for a long time, change the nature of those, that's vulnerable. You might lose that friendship, that relationship. Your self-concept is changing. So that's how I would think about vulnerability.
Can I ask you to read us a bit from the book?
Yeah.
And maybe tell us, I'm really interested in the title, and if you had big arguments with your publisher about the title. Was that a shared process? And how did you come to the point of writing the book as well?
So, I mean, it starts with a real experience that I had where I was thinking of proposing to my girlfriend, and I went as far as shopping for a ring with a couple of female pals who I took along for moral support. And then afterwards in the pub, they say, so you're going to get married. Who are you going to have as best man? And I kind of mind blanked. I thought, it's probably the Pinot Grigio. I went home, made a list of guys that might be on that candidate list. I thought, gosh, I work with most of these people. They'd find it quite odd if I asked them. And the rest of them I hadn't spoken to or hung out with properly for 2 or 3 years. And I thought, where on earth have all my friends gone? And if you actually look into it, it's a really well-known thing. So loneliness, you've probably heard of it, it's like an epidemic. That language of diseases is popular now, but it's everywhere. And we think of loneliness as someone that doesn't look like me, as someone who's maybe elderly, widowed, but actually increasingly it's lots of different people in society. So this book's about how I overcame my friendship problem and what the friendship problem is, I suppose, more broadly. So I'm going to read something all about something which I think is a symptom of individualism and of the loneliness epidemic. And has anyone heard of rentafriend.com? So you can, when you're out of this room, Google it. You can sign up if you wish. But maybe I'll put you off when I read this bit. So it's all going to become clear, but this thing exists. And when I'm sort of reading it out, and hopefully it won't take too long, but when I'm reading it out, an abridged version, makes me think a lot about what's going on in the world today with relationships and connection. Okay, here we go. It costs around £30 a month to be a member of rentafriend.com, a website offering, at the time of writing, more than 621,000 friends to rent all over the world. Set up by American entrepreneur Scott Rosenbaum in 2009, it's part of what venture capitalists almost gleefully refer to as the loneliness economy. And here I am entering my credit card details. Just as with dating apps, my first job is to complete my profile. I upload a photo of me looking cheerful, then tackle the enormous checkbox section marked activities where I'm asked to let potential friends know the sorts of things I'm into. Everything from, quote, looking for a wingman to hot air ballooning. Finally, I write an irreverent 2-paragraph description. My profile published. It's now time for me to go shopping for friends. You can search the database for friends that match certain criteria, most notably geography. A search for London reveals an infinite cornucopia of options, which I platonically swipe right through with a chilling ruthlessness. No, 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 maybe, no, no, no. Already overwhelmed, I decide to use a feature on rentafriend.com where you can send out what's essentially a tender for services and see who responds. When 24 hours, I have more than 50 messages, a long list of people who are interested in being my friend, or at least 50 people open to the idea of me giving them money in exchange for pretending to be my friend. I scrutinize and compare them like they're cars on Auto Trader. By the time I've ruled out people who A, look like they could happily petrol bomb a kennel, or B, have a profile photo of them playing guitar in the park, only 20 or so options remain, and that's fair enough. It's quite cool, but it's fair enough. Liv becomes front runner. I'm new around here, just learning the ropes. Do you fancy hanging out, maybe? I say, which in hindsight I realise sounds weirdly needy for a man about to buy a friendship. Liv responds warmly. She seems to be up for doing everything and anything I pitch. Art gallery? Love it. Pedalos in the park? Sure. Stealing an owl's eggs in the dead of night? My favourite. Immediately, this jars. A normal friendship exists in a constant state of negotiation, but this is purely one-way traffic. And after much toing and froing, I settle on an idea for our friendship date. There's an exhibition I want to see at the Design Museum at Notting Hill on Sunday. Meet you at Holland Park Cafe at 11? Sounds awesome, she says. I look at Liv's profile. Her description reveals she has a degree in creative writing. Might we be kindred spirits? She sends a follow-up message. Oh, and just to be clear, I charge £20 an hour. You can pay me at the end of our time together. I knew it was coming, but this message still wins me. It's so coldly transactional that this exchange we've been having, albeit online, felt genuine. I bought her friendliness in my guts. And now this was a crude reminder that none of this is real. You cannot trust any of this. The date rolls around and I head to Holland Park. Liv's easy to spot. Big wire and glasses, preppily dressed, dyed pink hair, cut into a spiky bob. She has the air of a Pokemon that's discovered Urban Outfitters. I forgot about that bit. We stroll around the park and Liv tells me about her sense. I sense it's a well-honed spiel designed for speed intimacy. We make our way to the Design Museum nearby. I've booked us tickets to an exhibition of the work of an artist called Ada, spelled A-I, duh. Although the point of the exhibition, I think, is whether artist is even the right word, because Ada is not real. She's a robot. Inside, we look at some of her self-portraits and we watch a video of Ada in action at her easel. She has a lifelike silicon face with eyes that blink and move, long, dark brown hair and a clipped RP accent. Named after Ada Lovelace, one of the very first computer programmers, Ada's persona has been carefully constructed. Her disconcerting resemblance to a living being encourages us to consider the blurred nature of the boundaries between humans and machines. I read out loud from the sign. Liv doesn't respond. After an hour or so in the museum, we go to a pub around the corner, a Sunday roast being one of those things you can't really enjoy alone. I've been on Rent-A-Friend for a couple of years now, Liv tells me in between mouthfuls of nut roast. She's met around 30 people in that time, although she gets a lot of repeats. I ask her if the people who contact her on the site fit a particular profile. It's always men. I've never met a woman, she says. It's socially awkward guys on the whole. It tends to be me talking at them, they just want to be with someone. Liv tells me about one of these repeats, John, an IT worker in his mid-20s who still lives with his parents. She suspects John is on the autistic spectrum. I've been meeting up with him for a year now. I send him cards and stuff. He tells me that I'm his only friend. After their 6th meeting, Liv stopped taking John's money. Now that I've relaxed, I realised I'm enjoying my time with Liv. She's good at this. And there was a lot to like about this deal we had going on. I got to see the exhibition I wanted, no questions asked. Because there was no money involved, I knew she wouldn't flake. And I had no obligation towards her before or after. It was company without compromises. There was also something freeing about knowing our relationship had a defined endpoint. We could be vulnerable with one another in a way that it can be hard to do with a friend you have a future and past with. I notice I'm telling Liv about things about myself I haven't told to any of my real friends. But what this is between us, it certainly isn't something I recognise as friendship. We finish our desserts. I go up to the bar to pay our lunch bill. When I return, I see Liv playing with a dog. Shall we go, I say. Conscious of what it looks like, I wait till we're out of public view before I surreptitiously push £90 in cash into her palm. Now, I could read on, but I've read for quite a long time. But there's loads more stuff about Rent-A-Friend I'm happy to talk about. But for me, it's like, that's an interesting story because it's symptom and cause, it's symptom of disconnection. But technology is temptation, and as a destination we can live in. And I kind of, later on in that chapter, I talk about almost all parts of our social life we can outsource, if you're wealthy enough often, but you can outsource to other people. So I go to a cuddle therapist who sells cuddles, and people just cuddle with her for an hour. I spend a day in Ipswich with a guy that lives with 14 life-size sex dolls. Not as weird as you think, this guy. She's quite normal. But you can go to therapists for that emotional support. You can get pets. You can rent friends. You can have online connections through forums. There's so much of our social world that you don't actually have to have a social life for now.
You talked about John being on the autistic spectrum, and I'm certainly on the neurodivergent spectrum. And one of the things for me is it's almost impossible for me to hide my feelings. And I often have a really strong physical reaction. And I'm trying so hard not to curl up into a ball right now of sheer kind of physical cringiness at the thought of cuddle therapy, let alone
I think I would
Rent-A-Friend.
cry. I think I would be in this cuddle, and within a minute I'd start crying.
Would you?
Yeah, I think I would.
Crying because you found it moving, or crying?
I just think I would cry. I will never do it.
Yeah. I would cry with horror.
It's interesting because I spoke to this person who did the cuddle therapist, and
Did she smell really good?
yeah, great.
Yeah.
What was weird though, is like, it's obviously, we went into this like pod which had a bed in, and this all sounds very sinister when I say it, but
Yeah,
it was,
it does.
you have to sign a contract before it happens, which is like, this is strictly non-sexual, like, she's very, very, very clear about it. And the first kind of minute I was quite uncomfortable, then oddly you relax into it, and I was like, I almost, at the end I'm like, I feel really relaxed, this is lovely. But she says she gets a lot of lonely men, she said a lot of disabled people, and it's the lack of physical touch, but it's people are so devoid of physical intimacy in the modern world that they're doing this. And it's, again, I just found it such an oddly grim thing that there's a market for cuddle.
And what is that grimness? There's something about uncanny valley, isn't there? And it's not a coincidence that you go to see that particular exhibition, I'm assuming, with Ada, the technological artist who isn't a human. What is it about that afternoon that you spend with Liv that you describe the benefits, but you also describe feeling, I think, maybe a little bit further in the writing, a bit solid. And what is it about that experience that doesn't feel like friendship? What are the things that alert you in the moment to this not being the real deal?
Well, firstly, it's transactional, which feels like a friendship is fundamentally based in freedom. You both opt in. That's what makes it brilliant. I think it's also the fact that all the convenience is one direction. So this is the thing I think is lost when we talk about technology and friendships and relationships, is that the inconvenience or the work that goes into it or the gritty bits are so much what make it real and make it meaningful, and this was completely taken out. But later on, I ring up Scott Rosenbaum, who I mentioned at the start of that little bit, and I said, look, this sounds a bit creepy, and he says, we need to think of it not as a completely new category of relationship. So it's not a friendship, but for a lot of people, this is a valuable relationship, but it's almost without a category. And so I don't know if has anyone heard of Replica, the AI companion? You've heard of it, sir? Yeah. So I've got a bit about that as well, but Replica's fairly big now, and you basically train a avatar to be your friend, and through almost WhatsApp messages, it learns what you like and how you talk. But a lot of people I spoke to in the tech world said, we will in the future not only be friends with AIs, but these new categories of relationship will be in our social mix. So on the one hand, it might be a solution to elderly isolation. You might consider that a grim idea, but this is what's suggested. And it can just be something we have that can be positive. But the risk of technology is it becomes a destination. It doesn't become a means to an end. We get lost in it, and it actually exaggerates and exacerbates our isolation.
And I think I want to come to that in just a minute,
Sure.
but just backpedaling slightly into the issue of isolation and dislocation and loneliness, which in some ways were almost taken as a given. And I know that your book particularly addresses male loneliness, and this is vital. And when you're talking about Liv or the cuddle therapist, that both of them were talking about it being primarily or even exclusively male clientele. Is that the right word?
Seems fair.
And, but yeah, if you would talk a little bit to that, but also talk about is this specific to men, or is this part of a wider problem?
Loneliness affects everyone. So here's kind of like what the data basically says. It's like a U-curve. So young people tend to suffer from it, older people, and in the middle, at different times, we might suffer from it, different forms of loneliness. There might be lack of social connection. It might be existential loneliness that other people don't have my experience. All these different sorts. But loneliness is also gendered. So, and different risk factors. So male loneliness, like I say, their network shrinks over time, and really the effects of male isolation compound. So if you look at the pinch points of life, so when men retire, when they suffer bereavement or divorce, men have worse mental and physical health outcomes than women because they are more isolated. And if you don't, and at the edges of these distributions, if you like, the most extreme form of isolation is generally male. And that really plays into, what we're talking about is these facilities are used by that extreme end of the distribution of people, and that's almost always dominated by men. But there's also a slightly grim cultural thing, which is it's considered more acceptable for men to pay for a woman's time than the other way around, right? So I think there's a bit of, they're maybe more comfortable renting friends or paying cuddle therapists than women might be in the other direction.
And so strange, isn't it? If we think about, if we kind of look to feminism and accounts of women's lives being, often conducted in a private space, so in the domestic realm, that in many ways women are forced into dislocation in that sense, or potentially through motherhood or through caring responsibilities. It seems almost paradoxical then that we would see that outcome, that men are more likely to be lonely or more likely to struggle with dislocation from networks, having lived so much of their lives in the public realm.
I don't agree. Sorry, can I interrupt?
Please, yeah.
Go.
Just because, like, women are told from the beginning of their lives to talk. So all we know to do is to go into spaces and talk. And all men know to do is to go into spaces and be silent, right? Like, it's different. It doesn't, and also, like, we've turned women, and also capitalism, has turned motherhood into a community. You know, it's not a siloed thing unless you're also facing things like disability.
I think to connect to what you said, also the fact that women have generally been in domestic spheres historically, they've become sociologists call it the king keepers. So they run the family, they pull everyone together. So same in my family at Christmas, who organises to get everyone over for Christmas,
Mum, yeah.
Who's buying the turkey, who's going like, oh, you must ring up your uncle, he's not very well, or we're going on holiday, pulling everyone together, it's your mum, maybe your sister, and then men get into relationships, they kind of outsource that, you know, the HR department, they'll deal with it, right?
Yeah.
So we're not socialised to do that social work and be that king keeper, so I think it's kind of connected. But this is maybe slightly more, I don't know if it's controversial, but I think it's a different point. Actually, I think male relationships they require more institutional support and more scaffolding. So if you ask someone like Dr. Robin Dunbar, evolutionary anthropologist, he'll say, these are generalizations as well, so there will be differences for different people, but generally male friendships happen side by side based around shared activities and often in groups, whereas female friendships generally are more based around talk and intimate disclosure and around generally smaller groupings or pairs. Now, there's some cultural stuff going on there, but a lot of it goes way back. So I think one of the causes of male loneliness and everyone's disconnection is we are losing this public scaffolding, these what sociologists used to call third spaces: home, work, in the middle, third spaces, churches, places like this, parks. These have been decimated. And if you are socialised to be more socially lazy, less able to connect, and your relationships revolve around spaces, you lose the spaces, it puts more pressure on men. But it's true of everyone, right? Like Robert Putnam, who wrote this amazing book called Bowling Alone. He's like the dude, or like the academic who talk about isolation and the decline of social capital. He writes in his update of the book that came out a couple of years ago, think about it in terms of supply and demand. If you want more socializing, we need to supply people the opportunities to be connected. That supply has gone down, but the demand has got to be there. We've got to want to show up and do the messiness of being around people in public spaces and inconvenience in relationships. So we've got less supply and demand is going down.
And it brings me back again to potentially the impact of COVID and lockdown. And I know, you know, in one of my roles, I'm a poetry festival organizer, and noticing a profound difference in the ways that, you know, performers and audiences and venues are operating since lockdown about shared public space. But also, I mean, that alerts me to another possibility around shared space, which is that in all of the work that I've done, we moved online. And this initially felt like a really, a really difficult move, and one that was about responding to, the absence of opportunities to be together. We all felt really compromised, the fact that we couldn't be together. And then eventually we realised that this was a space where almost everybody could be included. Not absolutely everybody, but many more people could be included. And we realised that we were reaching audiences and people that we had always excluded by virtue of being in physical venues. And it began to feel like a really huge opportunity to be an accessible and inclusive community. So I want to put that to both of you, and I think beginning with Cathy, is the digital world really the enemy of community, or is it the birth of new communities?
It's both, isn't it? I think. Definitely, so many disabled people rely on the internet for community. many of my friends included. And it's been a lifeline. It was a lifeline in lockdown, and it continues to be a lifeline for many people. But I also think that for people who do have the freedom of being able to get out and about and meet people, there have to be. It's very easy to get addicted to living life online and to unplugging from the real world, right? And if we don't have the right boundaries in place, I'm thinking to myself when I was a late teenager, so 56K dial-up, I don't know if any of you remember that. Yeah, 56K dial-up, CompuServe computer. We had it, and that was my first experience of the internet. And I am somebody who, I realised later, I didn't know then, needs boundaries in place. Otherwise, I don't want to say obsessive, but I do too much. I can't control myself very well. And so that's what I did. I was a lonely teenager and I didn't have many friends and I got bullied. And so I logged into chat rooms and made friends with lots of strangers, but not in a very healthy way because I didn't know how to talk to strangers in chat rooms. And they probably didn't know either, and I was very young and all of those things. And sure enough, what started happening was I stopped playing outside and I rushed home from school to log on. And suddenly that became, it didn't exist alongside my social life in physicality, it replaced it. And so I think that is also a danger for many people.
Sherry Turkle's, this amazing academic from America, has done a load of stuff about how technology interacts with how we define what intimacy is and how we do relationships. She's a really interesting person. She says, kind of her line is that what starts off as considered better than nothing very easily eventually becomes seen as better, especially if at that moment you're vulnerable, right? And so your story it made me think of that line because it's quite, it maps over quite nicely, and it allows us. Social media gives us a lot of temptations to hide, to flake, to have plausible deniability, to keep our options open. If you think about our social feeds, your friends appear in the same stream as YouTube videos, as songs, as GIFs, as memes. Our friends and family have become content. Just another thing it's tempting to scroll past on the infinite rainbow road of social media. And I think one thing I've realised that I find slightly worrying about it is it's the logic of the market is then put into social interactions where your attention is currency and you spend your currency on what you want. And if someone doesn't win your attention or if they're not worthy of it, you won't give it. And I think there's it does fundamentally change even the nature of the relationship, let alone do we socialise or not.
So you gave the example of not fully reading the last words of somebody who was dying because it was a bit long.
Yeah.
I've just made him look really horrible, haven't I? Sorry about that, Max.
But the point of that story was actually exactly that. And I don't mind if people go, well, you sound like a bit of a dick. But my point was going, oh my God, this is maybe a complete knob. It was somebody who was about to pass away with cancer. It was like her last post. And the first paragraph, read it, I was like, oh God, that is so moving. And I clicked see more. There's about another 9 paragraphs. I went, it's a bit long, isn't it?
Couldn't be bothered.
Right? And it's pretty dark, but I think we do often, it commoditizes people. So
Your point is it's everybody, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's, have we posted a nice picture, or is it nice and snappy, or is it going to make us laugh, or is there some music or a bit, and we're judging all of our friends and our families by that standard. I want to throw it open to the audience now and check whether, you're responding to the question about digital connection or anything that you'd like to ask or comment to our panelists.
What do you think is kind of, not the solution, because that's obviously quite big, but what could help people feel more connected and less lonely?
Fantastic. What would help people feel more connected, less lonely? What's your panacea to hyper-individualism?
I mean, the hardest problem to solve is ideology and philosophy, which has become, it's everywhere, right? I think one thing we could do is rebuild our social infrastructure. So we talked about third spaces, the kind of scaffolding on which our relationships with our friends and community hang. We've not invested in that. We've deliberately disinvested in it. There's a guy called Eric Klinenberg, who's a sociologist. He's looked at this a lot. And he says we often will invest in roads and railways and things because it's part of the public infrastructure. We need it. But we used to consider social supports as something that we'd obviously invest in as a public infrastructure. We don't do that anymore. I think we rebuilt that. Suddenly it become a lot easier. So here's an analogy which I think kind of shows why we need to do this. It's with like sedentary lifestyle. It used to be really easy to be fit, live, okay, because we moved loads in our day-to-day life. With work, with where we lived, we were always moving. Now, if you want to stay fit and healthy, you've got to think about it. I've got to go to the gym again, like 3 times a week. I've got to eat healthy. I've got to think about what I buy in the supermarket. It's a lot of work. And how often have you missed a gym session? Every week, right? Same with socializing. It used to just be a fact of life. It was built into how we interacted with the world. That social infrastructure goes, we now have to be intentional. And guess what? Sometimes we're busy. Sometimes we're tired. Sometimes we're feeling selfish or upset or whatever it may be, and we don't do it. And that's suddenly you have to be deliberate. When you have to be deliberate, then it falls off the wayside. So can we rebuild that social infrastructure would be the answer to the question. Sorry.
And just before we move, Sophie, what do you mean by that, rebuilding social infrastructure?
Investing in places where, if you want to make friends, have relationships, it's not you wake up in the morning and go, today I'm going to make a friend, right? Unless you're, maybe some people do, good luck to you. Generally, if you think about your friends in your life, generally we make friends by being in a place where we collide with this person fairly regularly and we probably have something in common. This is pretty much as simple as that. If you take away those spaces where those regular collisions happen, it becomes that much more difficult. So what are those spaces? It used to be church. I spoke to a taxi driver last night. The train was cancelled. I got a taxi from Leeds to Bradford. He was talking about the Eid celebrations, right? That gentleman, he still had faith. A lot of people, we don't have that. We don't have churches, but we used to have social clubs. There used to be a working man's club network, for example. There used to be a lot more parks of high quality. There used to be Rotary clubs that were for people of all ages, not just people who were in them in the 70s. That sort of social infrastructure. And this guy, Klinenberg, said, tech companies are always trying to say, we want to solve loneliness. We don't need your help to solve loneliness. We solved loneliness 1,000 years ago. It's not rocket science. Hang out with people. But we don't need an app to do that. And if you look at tech companies, he said, look at their social infrastructure. You go to the Facebook campus in Silicon Valley, 15 different pool tables, ping pong tables, a restaurant that's open 24 hours a day, everyone can eat for free, football pitches outside, lakes you can walk around, lecture events that you can attend. They've got the most amazing social infrastructure in the world, and yet they're telling everyone to go and do it via their technology.
And it makes me think of I grew up in Burnley in the 70s and 80s, and I grew up in, a very large family, very huge extended family, a pub round every corner, terraced houses. But growing up as a young queer person, undergoing lots of really difficult experiences, that was a very lonely experience. I was alone, amongst many people and lots of shared spaces. And I just want to hand over to you, Kathy, and see if you've got any ideas that add to what can we do about the problem of loneliness.
So my problem is that I actually hate people.
You're like, yay, lonely, whoa!
So I struggle with this. I like hanging out with people one-on-one. I don't like big groups, and I never have. And I've always felt or been made to feel that was a problem with me. When I was younger, my mum would so it's not her fault or anything, but she would send me off to brownies and youth groups and try and push me into those arenas to make friends and stuff. But actually I just wanted to play at home with my mate, or unfortunately later I then had my online mates. But but even before that, I just didn't want that big group dynamic. And so that's a very specific way of making friendships that is particularly tricky, because I don't want to start a hobby and have a new group of friends. I go to an art class sometimes, but I don't talk to anyone at it because it's a big group and I don't want to talk in a group, I just want one person. So yeah, I do find that quite tricky. I don't know what the solution is, but yeah, I don't know what the solution is.
To kind of bounce off that,
Yeah, go on.
so by the way, there's no right amount of friends to have, and
Yeah, of
solitude
course.
is not the same thing as loneliness, because loneliness is a subjective feeling, not an objective fact. But to bounce off what you said and to try and give a more, hopefully, positive answer to your question, I think we can all lead on this on a more individual, personal level and show a bit of agency, whether it be with your individual friends and you're organising people, you're inviting them into your space, you're meeting up with them, you're deliberately reaching out. We have that in our control. I spoke to a guy called Steve. He's got loads of friends. And I said, how do you do it? What's your secret? And he says, well, my friends call me the Sherpa, like those Nepalese soldiers that carry everything up the mountain. My friends call me the Sherpa because I organise everything. But if I didn't organise everything, we'd never see each other. That, for me, was such a simple metaphor of something we can personally do. Be the Sherpa, be the one who sends a text, organise the meet-up. Whether it's one-on-one with a small group or a bigger thing, we can do that.
Yeah, there was a point in your book that actually brought me to reconnect with a friend, which was, I think it was one of the guys that you spoke to, said when he thought of people he hadn't been in touch with for a while, he got in touch, he dropped them a text. And I did that. I've got no intention of meeting up with her. She's got no intention of meeting up with me. But text matters. Hi, thinking about you. Hope all's well. We had a nice exchange. Any other questions?
Yeah, so was kind of just to go a bit more into this social infrastructure thing. So I'm just reminded of the current thing I'm doing at work, which is looking at the Milton Keynes planning principles and applying them to retrofitting a city. And one of them was community engagement. So they were deliberately set out with community engagement as an aim. And what they did was created places every few hundred houses where people could meet, and created a newsletter to get, but obviously like everyone was new, everyone was moving into this place, and they were like, we need to set up a social infrastructure, which I think is really interesting because nobody does this now. We're building a load of new houses. What, you know, there isn't even any like, you know, public infrastructure, let alone social infrastructure. But then I'm thinking of like is the online really an alternative? I felt really terrible during lockdowns going to the same sort of open mic nights that I would go to in person, and there's no social aspect. Everyone plays their thing and goes away, and everyone's finished playing, that's it, shut down. And I was like, what's the point of this? There's no socializing. But at the same time, I run a disabled people's organisation. Pre-pandemic, we were doing things, we met in spaces. Now we've still got people in meetings online. I'm on a committee with people I've never met face to face, and actually almost none of the admin organising work is happening. We're all just so burnt out, but we're not connected to each other almost. So I think there's this double-edged sword with like, yes, it's giving opportunities to some disabled people who really struggle to get out and about. But I think for everyone else, it's almost feeling like closed in still. So just this thing on like what the actual infrastructure is and whether it can truly be digital.
Well, I don't think we need any government organisations to build digital infrastructure, probably. I think that probably exists. It's tricky because I think we do. Well, as I've said, I think we do need more social infrastructure, and yet we need to allow people to make it in their own image. Because, like you say, it's not. We're not going to go back to what it was in the 70s, where everyone is. I know everyone wasn't the same, but it was like it was built like no one was individuals, or it was in the model of certain individuals who were powerful at that time. So it's difficult. I would say something to kind of I was thought about when you were talking is that this idea we're closed off. I think fundamentally we've come to see privacy as the ultimate luxury, and the ultimate goal. What's a successful person? Someone who has enough money to buy a private home that is separated from everyone else, to own enough technology, you can have a luxurious time indoors, and it's almost what we get with wealth is the ability to push everyone away.
Mm-hmm. And back to that idea of, what's your excuse? What's your excuse for not achieving? Back to kind of valuing self-reliance and achievement above all else. I think we're reaching the end of our hour. Do we want to take a last question? Is there anybody who feels cheated if they don't ask their question? This gentleman here, and we'll make this the last one.
So it's a question about the sort of the spaces you mentioned. So you're thinking about churches, mosques. Often these spaces and or organizations and clubs come with rules, right? So it starts off with everyone's welcome, and then you're like, oh, that's a bit too gay, so can you tone that down, right? So how do we kind of create these sort of spaces that are not kind of exclusive by nature? Because I feel that's, there's always something that comes in that kind of drives people out.
I think they have to be created by those marginalised people, right? And not for capitalist gain. It has to be something that's just pure and not money-led, and
It's a really interesting question, because I think there's a tension between individuality and community. So a lot of these spaces do have to be a little bit rules-based and generic, because they've got to get enough people in the door. But at the same time, then you're trading off against not everyone feels necessarily involved, or it doesn't respect everyone's individuality.
Why have they got to get enough people in the door, though? For what? For money reasons?
Well, it needs to be sustainable.
Why?
Because otherwise, it's unlikely to be. The spend is unlikely to be efficient.
Yeah, but that's where we're going wrong, right? Like we're seeing this as something that can be monetized, but this is just people trying to make human connection. I don't feel like it should be monetized in any way.
But I think we were talking about not just you have to pay to be there. Was that?
Which is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because, as an events organizer, there's the kind of an accepted wisdom, or uneasily accepted wisdom, that when we run free events, we get a much higher rate of dropout. And that can make it really difficult to run events, so we charge a low fee so that we can guarantee that people turn up. And it brought me back to, I think, a point that you made earlier, Max, about when a lot of our connections are digital, we very easily kind of back out of them. But also recognising that connections online can be an absolute lifesaver. So maybe there's something about how we ourselves value whatever form of connection we're involved in. And coming back to your question about what can we each do, about recognising rather than devaluing or dismissing or belittling any of the connections that we have on a day-to-day basis, recognising that connection is connection. How do we upscale that to a social level? Maybe that's a bigger question. Back to Milton Keynes. But I am aware that we're at the end of our hour, and we finished on the word Milton Keynes, which I feel kind of uneasy about, but there's nothing that we can do about it. Let's finish on a different word. What's our word for finishing on? It's not Milton Keynes. Pontefract.
Okay, just a different...
So on that note...
Just a random word,
shifted it to a northern town.
On that note, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panellists, Max and Kathy. Cheers.
Thank you for listening. The 2024 Bradford Literature Festival starts on the 28th of June and runs for 10 days with a huge programme of events. From comedy to crime, music to memoirs. Head to bradfordlitfest.co.uk to book your tickets now.